Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first panel of the morning. This is panel number 4 in our Sheikh Abdullah Saleh Kamel International Symposium on an Energy Revolution with a question mark. I will be chairing the panel, and I am going to introduce all 3 speakers right now in one go, and then they will come up and speak in the order in which they are in your program. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, and if you want more information about any of them, it's in your packet. Our first speaker will be Dr. David Painter, who's an associate professor here at Georgetown University. And he has he's a historian and has written, his publications include Oil in the American Century, The Political Economy of U.S. Foreign Policy, 1941 to 1954, and there are other publications you can follow up. Our second speaker will be Dr. George Shambaugh, who's also an associate professor here at Georgetown University in the Department of Government and the School of Foreign Service. And our third speaker is Dr. Mohamed Ramady, who is an associate professor at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. And he specializes on regional geopolitical risk assessment and the Saudi economy, energy, money, banking, and labor policies, among many other subjects. So I would like to ask Dr. Painter to come up and begin his talk, and then the others will follow. Thank you.
Full screen. Yeah. Let's see, get the full screen up. Thanks. Morning. First, I'd like to thank the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for inviting me to this important conference. And second, at the risk of slighting those who I do not mention, I would like to acknowledge my debt to the following people and organizations. Anand Toprani, a former student of mine, and my colleague John McNeil looked over my paper, and I appreciate their comments and suggestions. Anybody who's trying to keep up with what's going on in oil today would do well to look at John Kemp's blog at Reuters or Steve Levine's blog at Quartz. They're both very good sources of information, and I draw on them. I used to work at the Department of Energy, and I didn't much care for EIA in those days, but I've grown to appreciate the role of the Energy Information Administration for their essential source of statistics and information. Also draw a lot on the BP Statistical Review of World Energy. Now, I'm a historian, and I believe history speaks to the present by providing perspective on contemporary issues. If we know where we came from, we can better navigate where we're going. Finally, I think some of what I'll say today may seem obvious to many people here, you're specialists. My response to that is that a firm grasp of the obvious is a necessary starting point for productive discussion and analysis. That's also a line from John McNeil. A firm grasp of the obvious. So I want to start out. Most accounts of the current oil shock focus on the supply side, the rise in oil production, and particularly U.S. shale oil production. These are some statistics from BP, and it's the top 7 producers over the last few years. And you can see that U.S. production has gone up quite a bit. Now, this is not exactly, this is oil, lease condensate. I think this probably also, there's another, what's been happening with U.S. production and reserves. And this is very important. You can see U.S. imports down, production up, U.S. reserves up. Now, not all of this is crude oil. There's an EIA chart about, you can see regular conventional crude, tight crude, natural gas, plant liquids, a very important part. That's also related to the shale gas boom. If it's wet gas, you can get some natural gas liquids. But you can see the composition. And, you know, actually, the peak oil people may have been right about conventional oil. It actually did peak around 2005. So, you know, production is very important. U.S. production went up about 4 million barrels a day That's quite important. The shale, there's the major shale plays, the Bakken, Eagle Ford, some in the Permian Basin. That's where most of it comes from. Almost all U.S. shale production comes from those three fields. And this production growth is largely due to high oil prices. Tax incentives and other assistance from the government were crucial for the developing of the hydraulic fracturing technology. But high prices stimulated investment in high-cost areas, not only in shale, but also deep offshore, the Arctic, the Caspian, and Canadian oil sands, or tar sands, depending on whether you're from Canada or not. I think it's oil sands if you're Canadian. So the growth in overall oil production, that's important, but it's not the whole story. I would argue that equally, if not more important, has been the demand side. And here's a thing on, the U.S. is still leader in world consumption, but you can just see that it's gone down. And the other places, Germany sort of dropped off the map. So this is, you also see on the demand side the role of China, India, demand in other parts of the world. So oil consumption has increased, but not anywhere near as fast as people thought it would increase. And again, that's because of high prices. And to a certain extent, drop in demand in OECD countries has made room for increased demand from China, India, and other countries without driving up overall consumption as much as it might have gone up. Now, obviously the recession has helped in terms of keeping things down, but also public policies have been important, especially in the United States. And I'm highlighting the United States because of its leading, you can see how much more we consume than everybody else, and especially in the transportation sector. But, well, here's a quick thing on the price. You can see the U.S. demand making room for, you see U.S., China, other countries. In some ways, its U.S. demand has been, in some years, negative and makes room for China and other places. So that's very important. And you can see U.S. per capita oil consumption has gone down. And again, that's high prices. And here's another thing with fuel economy. Going up is good. And carbon dioxide emissions, going down. And that's also what's been happening due to public policy, but also higher oil prices. But there's been a good bit of increased efficiency. And note that better fuel economy correlates with lower carbon dioxide emissions. And this is an important point, and one I'll return to at the end of my talk. Now, obviously, high prices led to higher production, lower consumption. And here's prices. This is BP, nominal, they call it money of the day. And BP, comes out every June, and they run about a year behind. That's good statistics usually lag about a year. So that's a little bit of a problem if you're trying to keep up with current. But you can see some fairly high prices for a while. And if you put together increased production, lower demand, you get lower prices. It's not rocket science. It's fairly obvious. But as I say, sometimes it's good to look at what's obvious. Here's what's happened to prices since June when they peaked. And when they went down to about $45 mid-January, they're up to about $50 now. Prices probably would have fallen sooner except for numerous disruptions in supply since 2003. I think we all know what happened in 2003. The role of geopolitics should not be minimized. It's very important. No one is certain what the geopolitical risk premium is, how much that adds to the price of oil. But constant instability in the Middle East since 2003, especially since the Arab Spring, has been very important. At various times, large amounts of oil were off the market. And also, people have been worrying about when Iraq comes back. Who's going to make room for that production? Or if sanctions against Iran end, how's that going to happen? What's going to happen there? Some people think that the resumption of Libyan oil exports in June and the blunting of ISIS' drive toward the Iraqi oil fields probably were the catalyst for the current round of price decreases. So, we've had a rise in production, a drop in consumption, both as the result of high prices. Now, the question now is, what's going to happen to production and consumption now that prices have fallen significantly, down, quite a bit since June? Now, again, this is not rocket science. Production, especially by high-cost producers, will decline. It's not going to happen immediately. Fields already developed will keep on producing, but future projects will be delayed or canceled, and that's already happening. This dynamic will be exaggerated by the special characteristics of shale oil fields. Typically, their production is high initially, followed by rapid decline, usually about 65% the first year. By the end of the first year, 35% more by the end of the second year, 15% by the end of the third year. Basically, with shale oil, you have to continually drill if you're going to keep production up. Some people have compared this to the situation to the Red Queen and Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, who is constantly running but getting nowhere. And the Red Queen explains to Alice, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to go somewhere, you must run twice as fast. Now, in other words, when the currently producing shale fields begin to decline and decline rapidly, if you don't have more drilling, more fracking, production will drop off. That's pretty inevitable. Consumption will probably rise, and now that's probably not as a good a thing. It will be probably gradually. Consumers will react to lower prices. Economic growth in the United States and elsewhere will also drive up consumption. There's some evidence that U.S. consumers are already beginning to purchase larger, less fuel-efficient cars. Some people even think maybe the Hummer will make a comeback. Hopefully, the United States will not repeat the experience of the 1980s when lower prices, first higher prices for the late 70s and 80s drove down consumption, but when prices collapsed in 1986, the U.S. went on a binge with SUVs, Hummers, and everything, and consumption went up. And I'm focusing on the U.S. because the price of oil is a larger factor in retail product prices here than in most other countries due to lower taxes. Now, basically, at some point, the market will rebalance. Less production, more consumption. Will lead prices to rebound. And higher prices will stimulate production and curtail consumption. In other words, every price increase creates the condition for the next price collapse and vice versa. Whole process will start over. Now, some economists will say this is fine. This is the way commodity markets function. I think what I'd like to say today is there's many reasons not to be complacent about this situation. First, boom and bust cycles have real and serious consequences for real people. Companies close, banks fail, people lose their jobs. Countries dependent on the oil revenues find it hard to plan, given the extreme variability of revenues, coupled with constant cost of obligations. This can lead to instability in producing countries and disruptions in supply. Second, the supply-demand balance has security implications. In general, low prices, while good for consumers, can decrease energy security. Basically, lower prices lead to concentration of production in low-cost areas and decreased production in high-cost areas. In the real world, the world that we're living in, often the low-cost areas are in unstable regions, and high-cost areas are in more stable regions politically. In any event, concentration of production is usually adverse for energy security. Contrast, high prices lead to decreased consumption and increased investment in high-cost, generally more stable areas. And this diversification of production is generally beneficial for energy security. In the United States, there's been a lot of undisguised glee about the problems that low prices will cause for some of our adversaries, such as Russia, Iran, Venezuela. And this is often accompanied by the delusion that lower prices will make these countries more accommodating. I don't think that's going to happen. This glee over lower prices is myopic because it ignores the consequences for U.S. allies, such as Canada, Norway, Mexico, African producers, even for Saudi Arabia. And growth in the oil sector has been good for the U.S. economy. The U.S. is a major producer as well as a major consumer. Third, oil is a non-renewable resource. It has to be discovered before it can be produced. The amount of oil in place, not to mention proved and potential reserves, is finite, no matter what the economist may believe. I think I'm with the geologist on that one. Technology and price have an impact, clearly, as we've seen with shale oil. But in the long run, I think geology will trump technology. Now, when that will happen is not clear. I'm going to repeat the quote from Niels Bohr, Danish physicist, who said, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future." So this could take a while, but eventually higher consumption, the cost will go up, and at some point production will go down. But oil is a very important resource, and it's important to use it wisely. That's another good reason. Indeed, there are many countries and many peoples who need to use more oil, who need to use more energy to increase the quality of their lives. On the other hand, it's also clear that increased fossil fuel consumption, especially oil consumption, is bad for the planet. And this brings us to what I call the elephant in the room. Any discussion of oil production and consumption must take the environmental impact into account. If the world's poor are to improve their lives, in part through increased oil and energy use, without additional harm to the environment, the world's rich must decrease their consumption of fossil fuels to make room for the necessary increase for the poor nations. Now, both oil production and consumption have significant environmental impacts. I'm not qualified to say whether shale oil production is more destructive environmentally than conventional oil production. Probably, maybe a little bit more, certainly not as destructive as oil sands or continued coal consumption. And, you know, let's be honest, conventional production, there's been problems. And offshore, we had the Deepwater Horizon, problems in fragile climates like the Arctic, oil sands development. These problems can't be ignored. But the other problem that can't be ignored, and something that we do know, that the impact of increased fossil fuel consumption, and oil still makes up around 40% of world energy consumption, on climate change is very clear. According to the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, human activity is leading to increased concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and this is leading to increases in average global temperatures, rising sea level, and other changes in the environment. And the situation is not getting better. Excuse me, this is what's going to happen when prices stay down. You can see this is a chart from Canada. Thank you. Estimate of how much production costs, and you can see under 60, and what's over 60 is going to affect a lot of people, but this is what's happening, what's been happening in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. It's been going up. It needs to stop going up unless we are going to welcome, I don't think we're going to welcome major changes in the climate. Now, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. The systems, social, ecological systems at work are very complex. So we don't know precisely what the limits will be, what forms they will take, and where they will hit hardest. However, I would argue that prudence demands that we pay attention to what's going on. And one way to do this is to increase efficiency in oil use. In this regard, remember the slide that I showed at the beginning. The importance of efficiency in oil use, of how that affects carbon dioxide emissions. But I would argue that there are environmental limits to continuing, let alone expanding, the high production, high consumption lifestyle associated with the U.S. model of development. Given this reality, I would argue that the most important question in regard to energy security is not how to assure enough oil to meet growing demands, but rather how best to move away from what is clearly an unsustainable path. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I want to begin by recognizing a co-author of mine, Aaron Taylor, who is in the audience back here. Aaron is an honors student in international political economy and will be pursuing a PhD in the fall. He has been admitted to a whole variety of really outstanding programs, so the question is just which one he will choose. He and I wanted to expand on some of the discussion here by exploring the geopolitics of the energy revolution. And what I'd like to do today is to talk about three different aspects of this. The first is to ask, on a very basic level, what distinguishes natural gas from petroleum. In particular there, to look at infrastructure questions. That has to do with the distribution and difficulties with production, the distribution of sources and difficulties of production. It has to do with, most importantly, difficulties in transit, limitations in transit. Those two factors create time lags, and those time lags affect both prices and the geopolitical implications of what this energy revolution is going to mean for us and for others around the world. Next, what I'd like to do is talk about the consequences of those dynamics and consequences of those dynamics in three different areas. One is economic, looking at the question of a resource blessing versus a resource curse. The second is political, and thinking there about the use of energy as a form of political leverage, as a tool of statecraft. And the third is a security implication. And there I want to talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities, increasing vulnerabilities, decreasing vulnerabilities this creates with different sets of actors, but also what is known as a security dilemma dynamic. That is, the incentives this creates for people to try to defend pipelines, defend maritime navigation. And that defense, even if not meant to be aggressive, could be interpreted in an aggressive way by others and could indeed spark conflict going forward. I want to talk about these consequences for four different groups of actors. And we'll conclude that way, that is, by talking about the consequences for energy exporters, traditional and newer exporters, energy importers who have found new sources of supply, energy importers like Japan and Korea in particular that don't have such benefits, and then transit states. So what makes natural gas and petroleum unique? I think one of the best ways to think about this is to look at this general trend in prices, and what really is striking about this, and most people know about it but they don't think about the consequences of it, is that there really is a global price of oil. And that global price of oil comes from the ease with which we can buy and sell oil around the world, the ease with which it is transported, the ease at which it can flow from one place to another within a country, within a territory, or abroad. That's strikingly different from natural gas. The transportation difficulties with natural gas, either through pipelines or through LNG, really create differences across regions. And the three price points up there are the low value is the price point for natural gas in the United States, which comes out a little bit less than $4 today. The price point in Europe, which is about $10, $11 or so, and the price point of landed natural gas in Japan, which at the point I did this was about $15. Today it's dropped to about $14. But nonetheless, the ratios here are pretty striking. The ratio of U.S. to pipeline gas in Europe is about 2.5 to 1. And it's another jump, probably 3.5 to 1 if you look at the difference between LNG and the fracking here. When those prices converge is when natural gas and the effect of natural gas will converge with that of petroleum. That will likely happen, but that's a matter of time. And the most important thing to recognize here is this infrastructure constraint creates time lags because of that transportation difficulty, because of the production difficulty, because even if you can get LNG to a port, you need the infrastructure to transport it effectively across various countries. That time lag is critically important, and it has a variety of effects that I want to emphasize here. Again, this may not be permanent. We've got a window, right? It's not clear exactly how long that window is, 5 years, 10 years. 5 years before the U.S. at least begins exporting a lot of liquid natural gas. But the amount it has to export in order to affect global prices, we're probably looking at least a decade out. So you've got a real unique window in there, window of opportunity, window of risk. What are the impacts of that? Well, economically, I think it transforms natural gas into a resource blessing, whereas oil is often considered to be a resource curse. The resource curse from oil comes from three basic characteristics. It's ease of exports, the fact that generally it has minimal spillover, the production of oil is generally minimal or negative spillover effects on the rest of the economy, and the control of oil and petroleum development tends to be very highly centralized. You can think about this in terms of Dutch disease and the impact that exports of energy or commodities have on your exchange rate that works to the disadvantage of other exporters. You can think about it in terms of preferential incentives and side payments, et cetera, to the energy sector. But there are a lot of potentially negative consequences that come from or are associated with the export of oil or other raw materials like it. Natural gas is different. Natural gas is different, again, because of its limited export potential. It's different because it requires extensive infrastructure, partly in development, but also in terms of transport. So you have to build a whole series of pipelines or LNG facilities or other things like that. And its locations are dispersed. Those effects mean that a lot of the dynamics that drive the resource curse, in terms of effects on exchange rate, in terms of centralization of control, in terms of the spillover effect to the economy, are very different. They're much more positive and much more broadly felt. And the degree of control is less. Now, we might get into a Standard Oil situation. The Standard Oil of the turn of the century might happen here, especially with lower prices. We see people going into these fields and buying up competitors. But the dispersion of gas and the infrastructure needed to develop to actually use it as opposed to just flaming it off, I think really does create a different set of dynamics. There are all sorts of estimates about what those beneficial effects are. They all come out somewhere in this ballpark, which is about for every penny drop in price of energy, that over a year's time, that amounts to about $1.5 billion in stimulus in the U.S. economy. Of course, the graphics of CNBC are better than mine, so I thought I'd put it up there. Also because CNBC tends to have a pretty substantial effect on the business community. They watch this program with a high intensity, and there was an interesting review of the price of the impact of oil on markets, and the comment was the decline in oil prices has really hurt investors in the oil industry, but it's actually helped absolutely everybody else. And if you look over time, the impact on markets is really pretty extraordinary. Over the last 30 years, there's only been 4 bear markets in oil, and none of them has lasted longer than 6 months. And the S&P has rallied, again, at least 18% with the decline in oil prices. So the gist of this is a lot of people are benefiting, even if the energy sector is not. So that's kind of resource blessing. It's a stimulating effect. Stimulus effect for Europe, stimulus effect for the United States, stimulus effect for others. Bargaining leverage. The big difference between oil and natural gas in terms of bargaining leverage is in oil, the leverage is general, and it's not easily targeted. You could think about leverage coming from the oil shocks of the 1970s. You can think about leverage coming from the low price in oil and its potential impact on Iran or on Russia today. But that effect comes from altering overall demand, overall supply. And the effect can't be targeted on those countries. It's simply the consequence of their dependence on that resource and how that plays out in different areas. So you can do this, but you do it by affecting overall market price. You don't do it by targeting a particular sector. Natural gas, again, is very different. And the focus here often goes back to Europe because of the extraordinary pipeline network between Russia and Europe. But the effect of natural gas pipelines, cutting off supply, fighting over prices, that's very targeted. It hits people down that pipeline, right? It's a very narrow, very specific thing. It's really a function of local prices, local alternate sources of supply. It's very, very much specific and very, well, very much, it's just very different than the effect you have in terms of political leverage of oil. This, of course, is just a snapshot of the European pipelines. And if you think about leverage, the story of the day, of course, is Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and Georgia, and the European situation. I won't talk about this because everybody most likely knows the story. But the curious thing about all of these dynamics is not that Russia is able to manipulate energy flows through these pipelines for some sort of political effect or vice versa. It really is about how that vulnerability to energy varies within the European Union, the ability of some countries to maintain higher levels of maintain higher levels of storage, the ability of some to shift to alternate sources of energy, and the inability of others to do much else. Of course, 4 countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, and Finland, depend on Gazprom for 100% of their energy. So there's an awful lot of variation in here. There's awful lot of local politics that affects pipeline creation and transformation in this system. One of my favorites is Germany, where Russian energy companies are actually building parallel pipelines locally because they've been kind of shut out of German pipelines. So you're getting an entire parallel infrastructures being built on a domestic front. There are all sorts of interesting dynamics here, but the lesson is simply that this vulnerability is specific. It's really a function of where these pipelines go, what the connections of these pipelines are, and the curious thing about it is without access to these pipelines, outside players really have virtually no impact on it. There is nothing that the United States could do at this point in time to provide an alternate source of energy to that problem. Those alternates are, even LNG from the Gulf or from other places, is going to be very hard to get into that system. So you're seeing there is a lot of development of alternative pipelines, but this is a long-term factor again. That time lag is going to be important in that dynamic. Which brings me to the last point, which is security. And you can think about security in terms of vulnerability to supply. You can think about security in terms of vulnerability to markets. And you can think about security in terms of a security dilemma. And again, the security dilemma is the idea that if I have to build up my military in order to defend my pipelines or my ports, if I have to defend my shipping lanes, if I need to secure outside sources of supply, or I need to preserve my markets, those activities require political, military, and economic instruments that could be perceived as threatening in other ways for other purposes, used for other purposes, and be perceived as threatening by other actors. So you could, even if you're acting in simply a defensive manner, you're likely to spark insecurity in others. How does that come out? If we look at today versus tomorrow, if we look at today in terms of oil, the primary exporters or suppliers are the Middle East, Russia, and West Africa. Primary importers are, this is the upper left, primary importers are the US, Europe, China, India, and Japan. If we think about natural gas, the pipeline business is all focused, is principally focused on Europe. Liquid natural gas, Japan and Korea by far and away are the biggest consumers. And Qatar is the biggest supplier. And 3/4 of Qatar's natural gas export goes to Asia. So this is today. If we look at tomorrow, again, there's some holes in this. This graph was put up, a slide was put up by other people in the show, so we've seen it in the symposium, so we've seen it before. But if we look at this, a couple things really jump out. The first is that the Americas, North and South America, have a lot of shale deposits. already there's a lot of oil bought and sold within the Americas. If we go back this way. But nonetheless, the Americas are somewhat less dependent on energy going forward than they have been in the past from other sources. The advantage of this is not just that you could get LNG exports, but actually you could develop pipelines between these fairly easily, and there are a lot in the process. The other thing that's striking over in Europe, over in the other half of the world, to me is China. The fact you've got energy supplies under Russia doesn't change much in that realm. There's some in Europe, some in North Africa, but it's really China that is extraordinary there. And I know the estimates of how much gas is in China varies a little bit, but that could create a lot of different effects that I'll wrap up with in just a minute. There are time lags involved, and some of those time lags are physical. They involve building infrastructure, they involve building LNG transit capacities, but a lot of them are also political. And I just throw this up here to give a sense of where fracking has been banned, where it's permitted, where it's allowed. But the curious thing about this map is that if it was allowed and if developed in certain parts of France and others, you could actually shift some of the vulnerabilities that you have with Russia. Whether that'll happen, I don't know. But some of the time lags involve political as well as economic effects. There are nonetheless a whole variety of transit pipelines being developed. The most striking thing about these pipelines is, first of all, they're centered mostly around Europe, but there are a couple key players that are in almost all of these negotiations that are really going to be hotspots going forward, and I'd just highlight Turkey as one of them that shows up in many of the pipelines that are under construction. Others, Georgia, Ukraine, of course, have been problematic, had complications, geostrategic complications. And then we've got development of pipelines in North Africa. So there's some things going on there. Again, this is just pointing out shale reserves in China. And what are the implications of this? I would say, again, it's useful to think about how things have changed or how things may change as a result of this energy transformation. And thinking about that, it's useful to ask, again, what the differences are between, geostrategic differences are between oil and natural gas. Primarily, I think the implications are that natural gas is more likely to provide a resource blessing rather than a resource curse, that the political leverage associated with oil and natural gas are fundamentally different, and that dynamic continues, but they're fundamentally different, that there are different vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities are shifting around the world because of redistributions of supply. What those vulnerabilities mean and what the potential security dilemma of build-up to defend yourself against those vulnerabilities mean is that for hotspots going into the future, the implications of this are, at least in terms of energy conflicts, those energy conflicts are not likely to involve the Americas, nor the People's Republic of China. But if we look at Asia, particularly conflicts over the South China Sea and energy there, it's more likely to be sparked or more likely to be driven by concerns on the part of, and vulnerabilities on the part of Japan and Korea that don't have this alternative than China, though China may well be drawn into that. And that Russian influence, as much as it's the focus of the day right now, is actually really limited. Limited in scope, limited in specificity in terms of who they can influence through that pipeline network. It's also limited, though, in terms of what others can do to mitigate those effects, at least for now. So looking into the future, what would this say? Not that we can predict the future just as well as Yogi Berra can. We would say really two things. First of all, if you think about the modes of transportation with natural gas, mode number one is pipelines. the real issue here is, or the real point of potential conflict here involves transit states. And transit states particularly are surrounded by others that are highly vulnerable. Those transit states are at risk, not just protection of those pipelines, but because building up defenses of those pipelines or mobilizing others to engage in defense of those energy sectors are likely to be perceived as threatening by others and could draw people in. And then with LNG, certain countries, particularly Japan, Korea, and others, are going to be dependent on LNG. The volume of LNG is likely to go up substantially over the next 5 to 10 years. But as that goes up, most of that is transported through choke points in the ocean, and that just suggests that the surge in piracy we had about 10 years ago that is shifting location at present will likely shift location again. And indeed, there's just a potential security threat out there to consider. Anyway, thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Presentation.
Yeah, this is the one.
Good morning. Salam Alikum. I wish to thank the Center and to Dr. Osama, but please, a special request, next time, don't invite us in the Ice Age. Try to find a more appropriate season. The other thing, I'm very pleased that I'm giving my lecture on Friday the 13th. There's a lot of scary things that are going to be discussed today. And a lot of things have been covered by colleagues, and maybe there's repetition, but I will stress different aspects as I go along. The title itself, Mutually Assured Destruction, Cooperation, or Survival of the Fittest. Saudi Arabia's strategic options. A lot of things are happening, and maybe there's a bit of combination of each of these, but like we have just been told, it's very difficult to predict, but I can see certain trends coming out where maybe there is an element of cooperation and certainly the survival of the fittest in the long run. We will look at quite a few things, and there's also some other very good speakers after us. I acknowledge here Professor Eckhart, who is a specialist on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. How different is the current oil price crisis? What are the realities of the current supply-demand? OPEC's power. What is this club? Will it survive? And does it have power to influence current prices? This issue, very critical, of spare capacity investments and supply disruptions. Saudi strategies and options. Are they really viable? What made them and prompted them to come up with these new policies? Shale oil producers, a threshold of pain, and then who blinks first? We have seen and been told about the various ups and downs of oil prices. They're all over places. But unlike the previous periods, suddenly we see this tremendous sharp fall. Before it was much more erratic. We've had this during the global financial crisis, but now we see really a tremendous decline, and it's a very sharp and sudden one. I ask colleagues from the Ministry of Petroleum in Saudi Arabia and Aramco, why did it take you by surprise? You know that the American shale industry has been working. You know the technology that's there. But as we will see, there's many, many factors that combined to drive this very precipitous sharp drop. The boom and bust cycles, 1985-86, Saudi swing producer status and the role. We're going to hear about this, why Saudi Arabia changed. Before, to support OPEC, to keep prices, it reduced its output from around 8.5 million barrels a day to 2.5 million barrels a day. The outcome, cheating. Other people took its market share, And currently it says never again. So let's see what's happening. This is what's happening. This is the disaster that's been facing OPEC. Over time, we have seen their market share being eaten by other non-OPEC producers. As we teach our students, while in the past they were the marginal producers, now non-OPEC are the marginal producers. In periods when they were producing 40 million barrels a day out of world demands of 60, now they can hardly sell 31 million barrels a day. That's their official quota. It's around 29 that they're selling out of world demand of around 90 million barrels. So this raises again the questions, is OPEC relevant in the future? Where is production and growth potential? We saw some maps in the last speaker where he talked about Latin America. You will see in there Brazil. Now this is about conventional oil. The Middle East is still dominant in the future, and so is Brazil, the offshore fields. But the unconventional, certainly the tight shale that we have been seeing, and the coal, gas, liquids, and tar sands, this is also the ones that are coming. So in the future, if they can hold their nerves, the threat of unconventional oil sands is there, but the Middle East and Brazil are still the dominant future players. OPEC, what kind of a club is this? It's a club of unequals. You've got two tiers, Ecuador, Algeria, Angola, Nigeria, very low production, but above all, a very small reserve to production ratio. How many more years left for them to produce oil? And how much reserves do they have? And in the second tiers, you've got the giants, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, and so on, and the UAE. This is very important to look at this because the current strategy is based upon certain key members in here, specifically Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, thrusting down the throats of the others the policy of no production cuts. And the reason is simple. They have less reserves, less spare capacity, and basically a very short-term reserve to production ratio. OPEC, a club that gets together to agree. People have always accused it of being a cartel. It's far, far away from being a cartel. As we teach our students, cartels are ones that can set a price, try to control the market, and impose discipline amongst its members. Astonishingly, if you look here from 1982 to 2009, virtually everybody cheated. 100% to even Saudi Arabia that says, no, 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 90%. The least cheaters were Venezuela. But still, everybody cheated. So it's a cheaters club. What do? In certain periods, they come in, and don't forget, OPEC, the secretariat, when they meet, like the one in November, the famous one, they just met last year, when they said we are not going to cut back on production, they have to do it, and all of them together, with no exceptions. It has to be unanimous. But what's the use of being unanimous? You agree on something and then you cheat. So they went through price settings, quotas, fixed, and then if you noticed here, very slowly as they were losing market power, they set targets, but it was a weak form of trying to influence world prices. What determines oil prices? I put it here very simply, T-E-N-P. Technology, economics, politics, and policies. We heard a lot about the technology, and certainly that's the one that's driving the US shale. The economics of it, and this is very important. So under technology, prospective developments in fields of geology, again that was stressed in previous excellent speakers, engineering and the processes. Economics, the viability of the different upstream projects under prevailing and forecasted geological, technological, and again something I'm very pleased others are talking about, environmental, and let's not forget credit market risk. In the end, if you want to develop these fields, how stressed are the financial markets? Are they willing to lend you? Are they in a good shape and do they have depth? So we mustn't ignore also the financial markets because, as we will see, now a lot of the American shale producers are facing financial stress. Finally, the politics and policy, sovereign political decision-making. What are the legislation, regulations, fiscal and tax regimes? In Britain, they have introduced very stringent environmental controls, much more centralized. In the United States, you've got the local, municipal, federal, all kinds of regulations, and we heard about the effects also of the chemicals and water pollutions and so on. Britain has done it in a different way, and it's probably one of the best regulated in the shale sector. What happens when oil prices change? Our previous speakers talked about the differences, but here I call it uneven pain and gain. $20 drop in price, what's the effect on GDP? Again, it was noticed. There are those that are the consumers benefiting over 12 to the next 14 months, China, Japan, and those who are the producers are the ones who are feeling the pain. There is an economic asymmetry between the oil-consuming countries and oil-producing countries. And here we have three: Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Why did I put here Iran and Venezuela? To me, the critical one for OPEC is Venezuela. It might default on some of its loans. You've got a 50% net debt compared to Iran, which has not borrowed. In fact, the sanctions have helped it not to borrow. It's developed its own domestic resources. Although the fiscal price even is higher for Iran, certainly this is the one to watch for. And we've seen countries, for example, very low reserves for Venezuela, while Russia still has a lot of reserves. Probably it's using it to support the ruble, but certainly to me, the one that is the key weak link in OPEC is Venezuela. What is this break-even prices that we hear about? Different countries. On this side is how much they produce in terms of the OPEC output, and you will see the effect of Saudi Arabia. And then you will see the others like Kuwait and the UAE following, and the rest are there. So again, the big three here are the ones that are dominating the current policy. But there, again, we see the effects that Venezuela, although it's an important producer, the break-even for it in terms of the other OPEC producers is high. Lucky GCC Arab OPEC producers. You see in there 4 countries with Qatar. Qatar is not a significant oil producer, but gas, as we heard. And the reason why it has this higher debt ratio is the fact because of its projects for the World Cup and the massive infrastructure projects. But any country in Europe, let alone the United States, would love to be in this position of having a debt to GDP ratio, and for Saudi Arabia it's in around 2%. Now, I remember only 12 years ago, when oil prices were down and Saudi Arabia's expenditures were high, the debt to GDP ratio of Saudi Arabia was nearly 100%. It borrowed domestically. It's not very transparent. It doesn't borrow internationally. This is the time for these countries to stop borrowing internationally to establish a benchmark. But there they are. Again, the ones that are dominating the current policy, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, very low debt ratios. So, as I said here, do as I say and not as I do, the big three. Why? Just look at this fantastic growth in reserves in Saudi Arabia. It's got around $790 billion. Some of it will disappear this year. The new king that was just confirmed, he gave about $30 billion in extra expenditures, but still, Saudi Arabia is saying, I can withstand the pain. So there's the growth in reserves of just one country, and the Kuwait and the UAE also follow the same path. What happens, though, if oil prices continue to fall? These are just forecasts, but I've got in here 3 scenarios, 2015 and 2016, where I look at very low oil prices of $20 a barrel, low, 79, let's hope it comes to that, a base, and then a high one. From all the indications that I see, it will probably be around the 40 to 45, maybe it will drop to 30, but certainly in between these. The net effect is that you're going to have a fiscal deficit in Saudi Arabia looming and coming up very soon. What do the Saudi Arabians say? These are quotes from the official ministers. This is the oil minister, there's the finance minister, and the ex-advisor to the Minister of Finance. We can withstand low prices even at $20 per barrel for many years. Now, can they do it? Will they do it? What happens in between? In Saudi Arabia, this is the scary story for them. Assuming they do nothing on domestic consumption and they don't rationalize. Now, rationalization doesn't just mean cutting subsidies. It also means efficiency in productivity, in changing the massive use of electricity at homes and industries through simple re-engineering the current AC system and switching something off. So in the sense that changing people's attitudes. But if nothing happens, Saudi Arabia, at some stage, not far away, will become a net energy importer. Can it sustain this, and will it be able to continue as is? If it does that, this is the second scary story. To be able to sustain itself, it has to see very, very high break-even prices compared to the low ones we see today. I mean, is it possible by 2030 or before to see prices of $200 to $50 a barrel? Maybe it does, but it's a catch-22 situation, as you will see in the next slides. I've posed here quite a few questions. Are these Saudi break-even prices unduly pessimistic? It depends on the assumptions we all make. Will the Saudi government expenditure continue at the same pace as the extraordinary $325 billion of 2014? Apparently it can. They just announced a budget, but in Saudi Arabia, there's absolutely no connection between what they announce as a budget and what turns out in reality, year after year. They announce a budget of X, for example, will spend 800 billion Saudi riyals. Good God. In actual, last year, you spent 1.2 trillion. So which means already that figure is useless. Then they say we're going to spend X amount on revenue. They have no way of forecasting or controlling oil prices. So that one is also underestimated. So they cannot control either the budgetary side or the revenue side. The king came and said, here is extra expenditures, which was not accounted for extraordinary items. So they are going to continue at a high level. Why can't they be rational? Arab Spring, people's expectations, a young population, keeping people happy, plus international obligations. We're talking about not in isolation here. They are supporting Egypt. They probably support Yemen. They have to support Lebanon and other countries. So all of these are not part of the budget, which puts strain on the Saudi budgetary system. Will the private sector still be the junior economic partner and not the major economic driver by 2030? Certainly, the diversification, the fact that the Saudi private sector is not truly private, they're appendages of the state. If the governments spend on projects, they do well. If the governments do not, they don't do well. So we still have a long way to go. Like, for example, the United States, it's a giant economy. If the shale oil goes down, we still have other vibrant areas of that economy. Will the Saudi population growth continue at the current levels of decline? It is declining. It's due to education. Females are being highly more educated. They want to have less, children and delay their marriage. Will the social contract undergo changes? Already reforms are happening and accepted. It's a slow pace. Will the energy sector remain totally in public sectors? We heard the last speaker say this is a national energy policies. Will more efficient water conservation, marginal pricing, privatization affect the use of the desalination? I doubt that. Will alternative non-fossil energy sources become important? They are announcing now solar power. This is a country that 360 days of the year we have fantastic sunshine, but it's expensive, it's difficult to maintain. Who are the non-OPEC competitors? We have those that produce above 2 million barrels a day, and you'll see Canada, UK, Norway, US, Mexico, and so on. But there's a whole multitude, and these are the ones, irrespective of their size, that were adding those marginal barrels onto the market. Whether it is Azerbaijan, Romania, you name it, each one was adding to that supply that started eroding and taking away market share from OPEC. Again, looking in the future, somebody mentioned Iraq. Iraq really and Iran are the stars of the future. If they can get their act together, there is peace in that country, let's hope so. They are the ones who've got the extra capacity, but for the time being, because of political and military issues and under embargo constraints, they cannot do anything to change the Saudi policy. This, to me, the simple diagram, is the dilemma faced by OPEC. In times of high oil prices, which is the outer ring, there's lower oil from OPEC is required. At $110 a barrel, the United States and others said, drill, baby, drill. You heard that in the US, I think it was the Republican Congress. But sometimes coming up with a beautiful, what do they say, the American snazzy, little slogan like that can be a nightmare, because after the spill in the Gulf of Mexico, it turned to be spill, baby, spill. So what happens then? At higher oil prices, you've got here the lower call on OPEC, higher OPEC capacity. Right now we are in this situation. Low oil prices, lower OPEC capacity investments, and a higher call on OPEC. And OPEC is refusing to play games. So what is happening? The IOCs have access to capital markets. The national oil companies in this scenario must cooperate with their national budgetary constraints and investments. If I am a state, thank you, dear. If I am a state player, I can only go to the Ministry of Finance and say, give me money after the final allocations that they have. The IOCs can go. The implication here is that right now the world is facing a demand destruction. Low energy demand from China and Asia, what's happening in Europe, and this combined with the American shale oil has brought down. But the important thing, and that's why I'm saying in the future we have to cooperate, be careful of being smiling now and saying, aha, we are in the driver's seat. In the long run, when you come to produce oil, there is supply destruction. And so you cannot just turn on the oil field like a tap. It needs investments. It needs capacities. It needs maintenance. Saudi Arabia is maintaining 3 million barrels a day at billions of dollars cost, which no IOC in the world will ever do, because what's the use of keeping spare capacity when you cannot sell oil? So even then, Saudi Arabia is thinking, is it worth it? So even Al-Badri, the OPEC Secretary General, 2 days ago, he said, I can see $200 price of barrel again when the oil price, when the demand picks up. I hope not, because what's going to happen is that we have the non-OPEC producers coming in. So who blinks first? Very quickly, last slides. Sharp fall in oil prices was OPEC's wake-up call. The IA estimates decline will cost OPEC $257 billion. New Saudi-led strategy, let market supply and demand forces determine prices. Why don't we set then a target price, saying, let's have a fair price? King Abdullah did this a few years ago, and all of a sudden, $75 became a benchmark for both producers and consumers. We never heard of another fair price band. Spare capacity and financial reserves underscores determination, but Saudi is willing to pump even more oil if need be to bring the current situation to a swift closure. You cannot have an OPEC membership with Nigeria stressed, Venezuela and others saying, what is this club for? I might as well get out. So we cannot have the situation continue indefinitely. Better lance the boil now, bring down even more the price, and drive those non-OPEC producers out. So it's a policy of shock and awe against the non-OPEC US shale. Will it work? Is the Saudi strategy working? On the surface, yes. Shell, Total, Statoil, all the mega boys are beginning to cancel projects. Now, to me, this is more significant. The shale producers are small. In the United States, you have about 550,000 wells. To put that in perspective, the rest of the world has got 15,000. Saudi Arabia has got 1,500. The average productivity of the US well goes from 8 barrels to 20 barrels. I had to rub my eyes to believe those figures. I thought there were thousands. It was 15 barrels. In Saudi Arabia, one oil field called the Ghawar produces 6 million barrels a day. It's the supergiant of the world. So there is the difference. Barclays, for every $10 price drop, 2.8 billion erased from Exxon, from Chevron. New estimates by the investment banks that in the end, all of this capacity is going to come out. What about, is it viable? I'm saying, and I think, Eckhart will come and, explain a bit more later on, every time there is these drops and so on, we see the swings, we see also periods of episodic nature of a financial crisis. What about the Americans? How do they feel? Despite optimism, there is evidence of pain and rethink. The number of drilling rigs in the USA has declined. The last count by Baker Hughes was 1,400. In November of last year, it was 1,700. So people are cutting back on the rigs. Important thing is, though, those that are there, they're beginning to say, let's produce. If I have debt, I will continue pumping to just repay back my debt. So these big names that you know, Transocean, Pioneer, Energy, Noble, and so on, are cutting back. And some of them is by huge amounts that they're expecting. And the important thing, $27 billion of US energy bonds are now junk rated. Only last year, some of them had investment grades. So instead of investment grades, investors are now asking for very high yield premium. And you can see here the amount of debt for some of the big players, 5.8 billion, Transocean, and so on and so forth. What's the future of shale oil as seen from OPEC? Again, we hear of these Bakken, Eagle Ford, and so on. 80% of the US tight oil production comes from 2 places. Great variability of oil wells production. Thank you. Wells declines are sharp, we heard that. Estimates that US tight oil may reach a maximum and decline. While new technology might help prolong production, doubtful that US tight shale oil will significantly change the long-term structure of the world's industry. In the end, it is the oil conventionals that are still the key players. So I think in here, I'll stop, that the break-even costs for the United States varies. I think yesterday we saw between $70 and $30 and $40. Maybe right now they can bargain and get extra costs to reduce this to continue with their cash, but I think they are in a difficult situation. The other thing is the ethical policies. Rockefeller, Stanford University, maybe not Georgetown, and BlackRock, they're all beginning to come out and say we need to move away from fossil fuel, which is also adding pressure on oil producers like Saudi Arabia and so on. So thank you very much. I took some more time. Thank you.
We now have about 20 minutes for questions, and so there are 2 microphones. I think the man in the back will turn the lights up a little bit so you can see them, and there are 2 microphones on either side. If you would have questions, if you would come to the microphone, identify yourself, and ask your question.
Thanks very much. That was very good. I'm interested particularly, George, you mentioned the potential of China. I wonder what you think about the problems of technology and water supply for tapping those shale oil fields, and where is that going to lead us?
That's an issue I thought that I'm not an expert in the geology. It's a really interesting question to ask. I think one of the speakers we started with yesterday who talked about the geology of the fields would be a good person to ask about it. The striking thing to me about the location of the fields is some are near the coast and some are fairly far into the western provinces. And as my first initial reaction is that the oil-water differences are going to be pretty substantially different in those two locations. I don't have a good answer, but it is a curious question. The other thing to ask about these fields is what their real capacity is. The estimates range fairly significantly. Recent calls say that they're maybe a tenth of the size they were estimated to be about a year ago. So there's a lot of uncertainty in here. But I don't have a good answer. I think it's a very good question to ask, though.
Thank you for excellent presentations and for guiding me at least into the complexity of oil prices and the political economy of it. I have a question for Professor Ramady. In your presentation, there was sort of a forecast of a scary development for the future of Saudi Arabia in that sense. And I was wondering if that would not rather be an opportunity for Saudi Arabia. And in one of your slides, you mentioned the idea of a social contract to be renegotiated. Is there really now is this discussion happening in Saudi Arabia, and possibly your interactions with your students about the falling oil prices being an opportunity to change the sort of rentier-based state of the economy, the need to reform the economy, especially you mentioned also the high rate of female education? Is that really happening? It didn't happen with the Arab Spring. On the contrary, there was more distribution of rents to sort of limit the spread of the discontent to Saudi Arabia. And I'm wondering if instead of being scary forecast, that would be more of an opportunity for the future of Saudi Arabia. I have a question for George as well. Thank you also for a very comprehensive presentation on the security issues. It seems to me that you are assessing vulnerabilities and possible future energy conflicts from a very state-centered security perspective. It's mainly between the major players, the major actors. Would your assessment be changed if you broaden your understanding of security and look more into also domestic issues? And that would relate with all of the environmental, social, and economic constraints that we've discussed since the beginning of the symposium. In that sense, the impact on local communities, local populations, beyond just the state-centered notion of security.
Thank you. No, I am not an optimist on this one. I think we've come a long way to start reversing this. I thought maybe there was a glimmer of hope in 2005 when King Abdullah took over, and they were just beginning to get out of those 18 years of deficits in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is inherently a budget deficit country. And he said the good times are over. So he started cutting back in here for some of the palaces. You know, a prince, if he wants to go from A to B, can't just turn up and take a jumbo jet by himself and all of this nonsense. But the population's expectation, the social contract, has become very ingrained. I say to my students, don't join the government sector. Be entrepreneurs, make mistakes. Go out and try to do something, and we hear this buzzword in Saudi Arabia, which nobody seems to know what it is, the knowledge-based economy. I keep telling them, Singapore is richer than you. It got no oil. South Korea is richer than you. Japan is richer than you. But it takes willpower. It takes, in the sense that people have really to see that there is no alternative. And nobody is giving them that situation that, what if we continue like that? So that's why I said they're tinkering around the subsidies. They're playing around on certain issues. But when it comes to really doing fundamental changes, those that are in power and the king will always want to be remembered. He's loved, not he's hated. And, he's done things where the population, say, look, compared to King Fahd, what he did, and this one is cutting austerity on us. It's a shallow way of looking at things. But unfortunately, when I look at my students, and they are the elite of Saudi Arabia in my university, I do not feel that they think that this situation is going to change. We're just going to continue, inshallah.
Thank you for raising the question of human security. I think human security and the environmental impact of these changes of energy, of water, of climate on individual people is critically important. The reason for the state-centric approach is, to me, a fundamental question of who you hold accountable when you do have problems of human security, when you do have problems of meeting basic needs. And most of that accountability goes back to local or national political leaders. That might change at some point in time, but I think for at least from a geostrategic standpoint, the principal players in this still remain those large nation states, in particular because they're the ones that are held accountable for it. But they're also the ones who are likely to respond to maritime pirates, terrorist organizations, others that are trying to respond to take advantage of this or abuse this in particular ways. So I don't dispute the fact that human security is important. I think a lot of this is going to take, the effects of all of these policies come down to individuals or small groups of individuals that are not defined by national borders. But I think the people that they hold accountable for that, the people that they then will revolt or support or go to for assistance, still really are at the nation level. And that those people also, that is the people at the nation level, have the tools and the resources to engage in a lot of activities that are either very productive or very counterproductive, depending on what your view is.
I believe he was ahead of me.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, sure.
Excellent.
Thank you very much for your talks. I have two questions, one for Professor Painter. I appreciated your note on the environmental impact of our energy consumption. That being said, I'm also concerned about the large share that coal still plays in our energy mix. And so there is the argument that so-called shale gas, shale oil revolution can help serve as a bridge away from dirtier sources of energy towards the renewable. So my question for you is, can this trend, is this a bridge to a better future, or is it a bridge to nowhere? And then for Professor Ramady, you touched on the rise in energy consumption in Saudi Arabia, and that has been there's been a big question about whether Saudi Arabia can continue to be a swing producer as more supplies might have to be diverted towards domestic consumption. You touched on, sort of efforts at solar energy and how that's difficult. I've also heard about a lot of investment towards gas and having a gas-powered economy. So if you could touch on other ways that the country has tried to limit its oil consumption. Thank you very much.
The interesting thing about natural gas as a bridge to the future is that generally policy people talk about that. But I guess it was a couple of years ago, a big book on energy security came out, and the policy people were all happy this will be a bridge to the future and we'll go to renewables. And a guy from industry said, nobody in the industry sees it that way. We're producing natural gas because we're going to make money doing it. And I don't, as a bridge to the future, that would be nice, certainly replacing coal, assuming that there's not significant methane leakage. There are some doubts about how the impact of increased natural gas production, especially by fracking, just leakages in the pipeline systems. So it's not yet totally clear. I think this is a good place for more studies, how much we're actually improving with switching from coal to natural gas. But I think the main thing that I wanted to get back to, and this is something I've been thinking about since maybe 1980 when I worked in the energy department and energy conservation. There's too much focus on the supply side and not enough focus on the demand side. The most important source of energy, I think Amory Lovins has coined this, is conservation. That is, and it has environmental benefits. The potential for saving, being more efficient, is tremendous. Now, in the United States, if you're interested in reducing oil consumption, you better be interested in urban planning, because that's the structures that we have in place, the path dependence. We put in place structures of consumption assuming low prices, assuming no environmental impact. Prices will not always be low. Higher prices could actually help, but you cannot assume that there is no environmental impact. So I think, the real solution is really looking more at the demand side and becoming more efficient. And I really think that's also an equity issue, because there are countries and people who need to use more energy, who need to use more oil to improve the quality of life, but the climate can't take them growing and the developed countries continue to use much. Now, Europe has gone down in its consumption, Japan, the United States has held it down, but we need to lower our consumption to make room for the people who really need it for quality of life.
Thank you. Excellent question. 10 days ago, the CEO of Saudi Aramco, the largest oil company in the world, announced they're spending an extra $7 billion on becoming the second oil or gas shale revolution after the United States. I was rather puzzled. I know the gentleman well, so I went and asked him, how are you going to do it? Where are you going to get the water from? In a country, in a region that already has water deficiency. If we're going to use more energy in desalination projects, and Saudi Arabia is the largest desalination projects in the world, and to produce shale, what for? He said to me, it's for petrochemicals. We are short of gas. And yet, a couple of 100 miles away from Saudi Arabia, a country called Qatar is exporting to Asia and elsewhere. For those of you who study the GCC, there is very little holding this group together in terms of intertrade. It's unlike Europe, where a large element is traded within. So they trade outside. The only thing that's holding together is security pacts. And that's the thing that everybody agrees on. So for Saudi Arabia to avoid this future looming of potential people saying, we don't want to buy fossil fuels. You saw some of the slides about the disinvestments in the long term from institutions saying, I don't want to be in this one. It's dirty business. Petrochemicals is the lifeblood for Saudi Arabia to try and diversify part of that economy. And we're short of gas. So maybe it does make sense to spend $7 billion, and they already spent $3 billion, in trying to find shale gas in the western side of Saudi Arabia, which is the Red Sea area and where you got the mountains and so on, and try to make sure that that is viable in the long term. But it's rather strange because policy making, unlike in the United States, there are so many different institutions looking at energy saving or solars or alternatives, and each one is in a silo. Before I came here by one day, I was in the King Abdullah Center for Energy, Economic Research and Efficiency. It's a city basically by itself as big as Georgetown, with 400 people living there. It cost $500 million to build. And every single light in every building in every street was on. And this is the center that's supposed to say to the rest of Saudi Arabia, be productive, be efficient, and, we set the pathways. It's this, like I said, schizophrenia almost, You pass policies, but very little, interconnected policy making to really take it forward. So Saudi Arabia is going to try and find shale. It's looking at technology. It's set up a venture capital company to try and acquire small companies in America and Britain and so on to bring the technology back to Saudi Arabia, because that's one of the things that made the United States a leader in the sense the private sector saw an opportunity and they developed that technology in R&D. But it's basically for the domestic petrochemical industry, which SABIC is involved in, Aramco is involved in, and also the private players. That, to me, is the only one that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes, it seems that, at least in the States, there's a fundamental faith that the energy transition we are, I think, for me it's an article of faith that we're undergoing a major energy transition. It may be several generations in length. And a fundamental faith in that is that technology will solve all these problems, that even though we have been investing in solar for 40 years and it's now finally reached the point where you can actually see it on a graph of the energy balance of the United States, and wind has been up there for a little while, both are growing at substantial rates. Fundamental to that is the belief that it's a technology issue. There are technology questions that could also be addressed for our more traditional resources, I don't think it's necessarily time yet to abandon the idea that we can, in fact, capture and sequester CO2. There are technologies out there being developed that could, in fact, revolutionize that. It's moving very slowly, but all of these energy resources grow very slowly at first. Most people don't know that IHS tracks shale gas production back to 1991, not to 2002, when most of the pundits began to recognize it as a force in the world. So there's technological developments. I'm interested to know whether that is has it been abandoned in the policy arena? Can we actually reverse the carbon impacts of these industries? And I think we have just begun to address, I'm working on a project now to address what do we actually know about how much methane is being released. I just saw a study that said that the City of Boston distribution network releases very large quantities of methane, and this may once again show us that we've met the enemy and he is us. It isn't those evil industry types on the other end of the pipeline. It's those of us who don't want to let anybody dig up the old pipelines. When I was a student in Boston, I remember reading a report that discovered that one of the reasons they were having so much trouble keeping water supplied to Boston was that some of the pipelines they'd tracked down were wooden. And that's the kind of problem we've got. Old infrastructure that we haven't put the investment in. There's a relatively low-tech solution that addresses this conservation, which actually the first book that made Daniel Yergin famous was a book called Energy Futures, in which he came to the conclusion that the best investments were in energy savings, and Amory Lovins has been crying about it for decades. It's still, those are the most low-tech solutions, but I wonder whether the speakers think that the issue of carbon may well be amenable to a technological solution out there some distance away.
Thank you. Before we answer that question, can we take one last question and then the panel can address both? Please. Go
Okay,
ahead.
great. Thanks for talking. This is very interesting. My question concerns the relationship between these nations who need the revenues from oil to maintain their budgets and financial condition. The constraints facing these states in the new low oil price environments, and how that has affected the bargaining situation between national oil companies and those states' governments. For instance, in Russia, Putin has been very keen on making oil a strategic commodity again, whereas in Mexico, like years of declining production just prompted the government to open Petrobras, I think that's the company, up to private investment. So I was wondering if you could comment on the interaction between national oil companies and governments in this new age of lower oil prices. Thank you.
And if our panelists could answer these questions quickly, we would be appreciative.
Well, I think technology is great, and I think low-tech technology is even better, and fixing up the infrastructure is very good. The problem is that sometimes the people who are making money doing things the way they are being done are also spending money to prevent people from doing the other things. You know, it does cost money to do things. But I think, you know, the combination of lots of small steps together will make a big difference in terms of conservation. And I think it's not demonizing the companies, though on their business side, possibly their political side, and maybe that's more appropriate. But I think, you know, it's one thing that can be done in small steps, but I'll pass this on to my colleagues.
I have a real faith in technology, and indeed put a lot of hope in that. On the other hand, I think a lot of technology just transfers one type of or one form of pollution to another. So we can worry about air pollution. Everybody can buy a Tesla with the great salaries we make as academics and drive those cars, but then you've got the waste of the battery at the end of the day. So it's not obvious. It's not. Energy and matter are combined, right? You can't get something for nothing. So it's, to me, it's partly a question of efficiency, but it's also a question of a trade-off between what form of pollution is better or worse at a particular time. And air and water tend to trump other things, but nonetheless, that's always an issue.
I want to address the last question. The relationship of the IOCs with the producing countries, I think you saw the examples of the mega IOCs cutting back and scaling projects. I mean, here is Qatar, the highest GDP per capita in the world, and yet Shell canceled nearly a $7 billion project saying it's not viable anymore. So they do look at very long-term projections, and I think they see a fundamental shift and change in the energy equation in the world. So unlike the small producers where they can come back if prices go up, these are mega projects. I also mentioned that there's a very difficult relationship between the national oil companies with the central state. In times of stress, like for example Venezuela or Nigeria, for a national oil company to come and say, please, can you give me money because I want to expand spare capacity and oil prices are falling, they're not going to listen to them very well because the government is going to spend money on other things that makes them popular. The only exception to this, amongst the ones that I looked in OPEC, is Saudi Arabia. Aramco receives all the funds when oil is sold. It gets its money in JP Morgan, it still hasn't changed over these years, and then it sets aside for itself its capital expenditure and its operating expenditure, and whatever is left it gives to the government. You do what you want. So it safeguards itself, it ring fences its own future potential. But even in the last few weeks, Saudi Aramco is looking at its projects and cutting back and trying to really try to create some efficiency. So the answer is, it's the large boys that I am watching, the large players in the world. What are their intentions? And are they cutting back on some projects? Not necessarily in the Middle East. You saw also in Canada, Total, Statoil in Norway, and so on. They all seem to be on this mode of cutting back on long-term projects, which in fact is going to diminish the supply destruction that we talked about in the future and maybe push up again the price. Thank you.
We'll return to this room in 15 minutes, but thank you to the audience for participating, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists.